What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. I'm working on a very large project, and I'm doing massive research on Henry Armstrong. And I'm finding out so many things about Henry Armstrong that I didn't realize. How many fights he actually threw. Learning more about his family. Learning more about things I just didn't realize. And I want to be able to tell his story in its entirety. You see, I met Henry Armstrong, and that was one of the highlights of my life. Besides meeting Ray Robinson and Bo Jack and Ike Williams and Charlie Burley, Archie Moore, Joe Walcott. Never met Joe Louis. I met Kid Chocolate. I met Larry Estridge, who was a colored middleweight champion. But Henry Armstrong was someone that I actually idoled, along with all those men that I mentioned to you. Jimmy Bivens, and I can go on and on. But Henry Armstrong told me some things that I never forgot. You see, Henry Armstrong was losing his wife, and he rushed her. Well, the attempt was made to rush her to the hospital, and they was not going to make it. So his wife told him, pull over to the side. We're not going to make it. Just put your arms around me and tell me you love me. And that he did, and she passed away in his arms on Taylor Avenue, California. And Henry Armstrong was such a devoted, responsible young man, but yet he was a ladies' man. He was someone who adored fast life, if you will. And what was remarkable about Henry Armstrong, he had a gear that once you set that pace for him, there was no turning back. You see, he was originally known as Henry Jackson, born December 12th, 1912 in Columbus, Mississippi. He would die October 24th, 1988 in Los Angeles, California. And he began boxing in 1929 to 1932 as an amateur. And Henry Armstrong was working on a railroad when a newspaper hit him on the leg. The same newspaper that Thurston McKinney would pull out his back pocket and would open up and show Joe Louis when he was on his way to his violin lessons. The very first newspaper that Archie Moore would read when he was digging ditches as a young boy. And it said Kid Chocolate had earned $75,000 when he defeated Al Singer. This was in 1929. Henry Armstrong and Archie Moore began to box. Joe Louis would begin to box. Holman Williams, Leroy Hayes, Danny Cox, many of them would begin to box. Now, Henry Armstrong had a brother. His name was Harry. And at that time, it was not popular to have a child out of wedlock. So Harry Armstrong was known as Henry Jackson's cousin. But Henry Armstrong was Harry Armstrong's brother. And they would keep that secret for many years. But they looked alike. Harry Armstrong and Henry Jackson. And they would travel together to the West Coast. And Harry Armstrong would become Henry Jackson's manager. Harry Armstrong knew of Pee Wee Beale. And Pee Wee Beale knew Al Savani. Henry Armstrong couldn't get into the gymnasium. They wouldn't allow him in. And one day, Leroy Hayes, who was a very good black fighter, was on his way up to the gym and he saw Armstrong, along with Harry Armstrong and Henry Jackson, sitting on the steps. And he walked right past him. And as he was leaving the gym, he was walking back down the stairs and they were still sitting there. And he asked Henry Jackson, "Why are you sitting on these steps?" Jackson told Leroy Hayes that we can't get in. He said, "Hold on one second." That's when he got Pee Wee Beale. And Beale got him in the gym and introduced him to Al Savani. And they asked Henry Jackson to move around on the floor. And Henry Jackson was not technically sound, but the determination and the desire and the killer instinct was there. And they saw what could possibly be the next great thing in the world of pugilism. So Pee Wee Beale, who knew Harry Wiley Sr. in the West Coast, former YMCA boxer, Harry Wiley Sr. was delivering ice and pulling it out of the ice truck. And behind him was a taxi cab that would run into the back of him. And it would crush his legs. Wiley Sr. couldn't box anymore. And he would eventually become a trainer. He would wrap the hands of Sam Langford. He would carry the water bucket of Jack Dempsey. He was highly respected. But in my opinion, top 3 greatest trainers of all times. Jimmy DeFrosty. And DeFrosty told him, "You have the ability to become a trainer yourself." And Harry Wiley Sr. would take Jimmy DeFrosty's advice and he would begin training fighters such as Sammy Mandel, Lou Ambers, Danny Cox, Louis Spider Valentine, Winston Jensen, Riley Jackson, Pearl Morgan, Walker Smith. So Pee Wee Beale would introduce Henry Jackson. At that time, he was Medley Jackson to Harry Wiley Sr. And this was for the 1932 Olympic Games. And when Harry Wiley Sr. asked Millie Jackson, move around on the floor, Harry Wiley Sr. would be amazed. Although Henry Jackson was not technically sound, but his will and determination, the guts that he would show just through shadowboxing, the tremendous effort and desire was enough to convince Harry Wiley Sr. that this young man could be the goods. But he had to settle him down. He had to use his height and ferociousness, his determination to his advantage. He did not want Henry Jackson look into the eyes of his opponent. So he developed a strategy for Henry Jackson, because Henry Jackson's problem was he didn't look at his opponent. And Wiley Sr. tried to get Henry Jackson to lift his head up and look at his target. And Jackson just couldn't do it. So they came up with an idea, watching the opponent's feet, staying close to his opponent, using his head to steer the opponent in the direction that he wants him to go by placing it on his chest, putting pressure on his right side, and getting the opponent to focus on defense. Wiley Sr. would have Henry Armstrong take his left elbow and knock down the right hand, constantly keeping his opponent occupied through defense. And whenever his opponent would brace his feet on the floor and try to slug back, Armstrong would shoulder roll and come up with an overhand right, and began moving his opponent once again. And he would walk his opponent down all over the ring. And once he got him in a corner or the side of the ropes, he would open up with massive combinations, head and body, until his opponent would give in. The issue was, in the amateurs, Henry Armstrong, who Henry Jackson at that time, Millie Jackson, didn't have enough time to wear his opponent down. So he would miss out on the Olympic Games in 1932. Having well over 100 bouts, he would turn professional, and he would start a new career. And when Millie Jackson didn't make the Olympic team, he would go back west to Sacramento, and he would continue with his boxing career. Now, we'll go through some names of the opponents of Henry Armstrong. And these opponents are Hall of Famers, if you ever heard one. What Henry Armstrong has accomplished in his career is so iconic that it's mind-blowing. Men that he sparred with, what he had to endure during the time that he came. Armstrong could not change in locker rooms or dressing rooms. He had to change in mop closets, 4x4 in diameter, with buckets of mops still stored away He would have to shadow box in mop closets, in the dark, no mirror. You see, Henry Armstrong admired George Dixon, who was the first black featherweight champion in boxing history. And he wanted to learn more about George Dixon. George Dixon died in 1908. 1909 was a mourning for this great fighter. George Dixon would discover shadowboxing. And Henry Armstrong, who admired George Dixon, admired shadowboxing and would take that to a whole new level. And he would shadowbox 15 rounds before every major fight. And this was just a ritual for Henry Armstrong. Would get his stamina, his blood flowing. Get him to sweat and loosen up. But the pressure that Henry Armstrong would apply on his opponents was almost criminal. One of the opponents that Henry Armstrong would face would be a young man from Philadelphia. He would become a junior lightweight champion. His name was Benny Bass. He was known as the Little Fish. Now, Benny Bass stood 5 foot 1.5 inches. He had a 64-inch reach. He was born December 4th of 1904, Russian Empire, in modern-day Ukraine. He died June 25th, 1975. He was 70 years of age at the time of his death. He would reside in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He had 243 total bouts, 190 wins, 72 knockouts, 41 losses, 10 draws, and 2 no contests. Now on September 12, 1927, Benny Bass would defeat Red Chapman, and he would earn the NBA World Featherweight Championship title in front of 30,000 spectators in Philadelphia. And it was an amazing accomplishment. But Benny Bass was on his way. Now, Bass would take on fighters such as Babe Herman and Red Chapman, Eddie Mack and Mike Ballerino, Joe Glick, Eddie O'Keefe, Eddie Anderson, and Todd Moran, Charles Bud Taylor, Johnny Jaddock, Harry Blitman, and Frankie Wallace, Tony Falco, Eddie Shea, Phil Zivix, and Harry Dumlesky, Eddie Cool, Davey Abad, Leo Kid Roy. Tremendous fighters during that time, but remarkable ones as well. And Benny Bass would be one of the fighters that Henry Armstrong would be in the ring with. He was a former fighter, a former junior lightweight champion, who would lose his title to Henry Armstrong's idol, the Cuban Bong Bong, Kid Chocolate. Another fighter that Henry Armstrong would be in the ring with would be Fritzy Zivik. He was known as the Croat Comic. He was born May 8, 1913 in Lawrenceville, Pennsylvania. He would die May 16, 1984 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He stood 5 foot 10 inches, weighed 128 to 160 pounds, and had 4 other brothers. He stood 5 foot 9 inches, and some say 5 foot 10 inches. But rest assured, Fritzy Zivik will show you how to fight. Had close to 64 losses. But Ray Robinson later in life would say he learned more from fighting Fritzy Zivik than anyone else in his boxing career. And Fizzy Zivic would be in the ring with fighters such as Lou Jenkins, Jake LaMotta 4 times, Sammy Aingat, Johnny Jaddick, Izzy Genezzo, Charlie Burley, Ruben Shank, Johnny Barraro, Bobby Poncho, and Al Bummy Davis, Freddie Red Cochrane, Milt Aaron, Billy Arnold. Very good fighter was Fizzy Zivic, but he was a very dirty fighter. He knew how to use everything in his toolbox. You see, I mentioned he had 4 brothers, so he understood how to fight. 2 of those brothers fought in the same Olympic Games, and along with the Spinks brothers, they would be the only 2 brothers to win gold medals in the same games. But Fizzy Zivic would face Henry Armstrong October 4th, 1940. He would defeat him and take his title. 41, he would stop Armstrong. But then he would lose to Armstrong shortly after. Armstrong would be in the ring with Lou Ambers. He was known as the Herkimer Hurricane. Born November 8, 1913 in Herkimer, New York. He would die April 24th, 1995 in Phoenix, Arizona. I had the pleasure of meeting Fizzy Zivic as well as Lou Ambers. Ambers stood 5 foot 6 inches, weighed 131 to 140 pounds. He was in the ring with Tony Canzoneri and Fizzy Zivic, Sammy Fuller and Al Bummy Davis, Pedro Martinez, Frankie Glick, Frankie Wallace, and Jimmy Garrison, Paul Jr., Barney Ross, and many, many others. Now, Lou Ambers would pick up the lightweight championship title May 7th, 1937, by defeating Tony Canzoneri in 15 rounds. The fight took place in New York's Madison Square Garden. And this was something that many waited to see. He'd also be in the ring with Alberto Baby Arizmendi. Arizmendi and Henry Armstrong would be well familiar with one another. But Lou Ambers would lose his title to Henry Armstrong 1938, New York's Madison Square Garden in 15 rounds. Armstrong would swallow a tremendous amount of blood to prevent the referee from stopping the contest. Henry Armstrong would be in the ring with Sammy Aingat. He was known as the Clutch. Born January 17, 1915 in Washington, Pennsylvania. He would die October 22, 1980 in Cleveland, Ohio. Now, Aingat stood 5 foot 8 inches, weighed 126 3/4 to 147 pounds. He was managed by Charlie Jones. He'd be in the ring with fighters such as Ike Williams and Kid Aztaker, Petey Cerrone, Wesley Ramsey, Davey Day, Baby Arizmendi, Luther Slugger White, Freddie Miller, Lou Jenkins, Tommy Spangal. What a fighter Sammy Aingat was. He would lose to Ray Robinson and some other great fighters, but he was fantastic in the ring himself. He was a 2-time lightweight champion. But he was very determined in this ring. Henry Armstrong would face both Ray Robinson and Bo Jack in 1943. And this was after Henry Armstrong was champion. Henry Armstrong was beloved in New York's Madison Square Garden, and he was beloved on the West Coast. He was well respected by boxing enthusiasts. The crowd loved him. He was a warrior and would always go out, if so, like a soldier. He would face Juan Zarita and Mike Belois, Tibby Larkin and Lou Jenkins, Chalky Wright, Severino Garcia, Midget Walgott, Frankie Clegg. He fought Salusa Slugger White, Ralph Zanelli, Al Turner, Davey Day, Willie Joyce, fought a fighter by the name of Bobby Manuel. I don't know who he didn't fight. Between April 28, 1933 and September 8, 1935, he would be in the ring with Perfecto Lopez. 7 wins, 2 knockouts, 3 draws, 12 bites combined. Between November 3, 1934 and January 10, 1939, he'd be in the ring with Alberto Baby Arizmendi. 3 wins, 3 losses, 6 bouts combined. Between November 3, 1934 and January 10, 1939, he'd be in the ring with Baby Arizmendi. What a fighter this man really was. He had 22 total world welterweight championship contests, 19 total world welterweight championship title defenses, 3 total undefeated and underrated world championship titles. He held them simultaneously. Had a record of 27 wins, no losses, 26 knockouts in 1937 alone. 14 wins, no losses, 10 losses. It was 59 wins, 1 loss, 1 draw, with 51 knockouts. So he would have 14 wins, no losses, with 10 knockouts. He fought the featherweight championship bouts 107 times. Incredible fighter he was. So once again, he would have 107 featherweight bouts. A world champion, October 29, 1937. Welterweight bouts, he had 73. World championship contest, May 31st, 1938. Lightweight bouts, he had 3. August 17th, 1938. Defeated Peter Cerrone in New York's Madison Square Garden. 75 wins, 12 losses, 94 bouts. He was stopped in 6 rounds for the New York Sack vacant NBA World Championship titles. October 29, 1937. Now he defeated Barney Ross, New York's Madison Square Garden. Fought him at the Garden Bowl. 90 wins, 12 losses, 109 bouts. 15 rounds of action. For the New York Sack and the NBA World Lightweight Championship Contest, May 31st, 1938. He'd be defeated by Fitzy Zivic, 15 rounds, New York's Madison Square Garden Bowl. October 4th, 1940. It was actually at the New York Madison Square Garden building. And it would fight twice there. So Henry Armstrong, once again, remarkable fighter. And he would be featured in the project that I'm working on in full detail with articles and photos, so on and so forth. So thanks for listening. In conversation of a great fighter, hammering Henry Armstrong. All great fights and all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. I'm Scrapbook Boxing. Thanks for listening. Peace.